Hello everyone, thanks for joining us today. We're just going to give it one more minute as a few more people are entering the webinar and then we'll start. Hi again everyone, thanks for your patience. We're now ready to start. So this is our remote access management webinar and Q&A. I'm going to hand over to Steve Beaumont in a sec, but before we get going, if you have any questions during the webinar itself, you just type them into the questions box and we'll pick them up at the end or as we go through. And then at the end of the webinar, you can drop in any new questions you have and the team will answer them one by one. So I'll hand over to Steve now.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. So, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone's feeling nice and bright and breezy and ready for a good session around some of the remote access solutions from Microsoft and have a good Q&A session. So just a quick highlight of what it is that we're going to be looking at today. So we're going to start off with a quick session introduction just to highlight some of the different technologies and some of the approaches in terms of Microsoft strategy towards this. Then we'll go across some of the building blocks, so where are the type of technologies and areas that you start to look at to gain some benefits across this. And then we'll dive a little bit into some of the advanced and some of the more E5 licensing stacks of technologies and where you can grow and build on the security solutions for your organization. And then we'll move into very much an open Q&A. So please, as we're going through some of this lot, if it stirs some thoughts and some ideas and you have a question, type it into the chat panels, get them ready, because then we can basically talk around all the various different bits and answer some of these questions that you may have had as we're discussing pieces, or just diverge off on general topics around this type of area that we talk about today. Now, I'd like to welcome to the panel for today. There is myself. My name is Steve Beaumont. I'm the CTO at PowerOn and look after everything that is technology-wise around the management and security stack from Microsoft, ranging from both the desktop side, the identity, right through to the data center. I'm also joined by a couple of colleagues from both PowerOn and Microsoft themselves, and we have Heinrich. I'll let Heinrich, you introduce yourself.
Morning, thank you very much, Steve. My name's Heinrich. I'm one of the business consultants here at PowerOn Platforms. My sort of world centers around kind of clients' requirements and what they need to do and how they want to go about them. And then obviously as part of that remit, my sort of job is to obviously then help put some of those plans and bits and pieces into fruition. Like Steve, my background is very much kind of the sort of cloud space at the moment, obviously with smatterings of Windows 10 in there as well. So yeah, very much looking forward to today's session. Over to you, Mr. Lyons.
Thank you very much. And I'm Nick Lyons. I'm the Security Product Marketing Manager for the Modern Workplace in Microsoft UK. What that means is I look after the security business, I look after the evangelism side of things, and also make sure that everyone's ready to actually get this stuff out and in there. It's not just coloured pens in the marketing team.
Awesome, absolutely brilliant. So we're going to hand over to Nick now and let him go through the introduction and bring us up to speed on what the type of areas and stuff that we should be looking at with this. Nick, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's quickly just run through what we're seeing and what sort of things Microsoft is seeing now. I realise this is a little bit obvious to everyone on the call, but again, it just serves as a purpose to try and position what we're trying to do and how we're trying to help. So we've seen, unsurprisingly, a massive spike in the need for remote access. You can guess why. I'm not going to insult anyone's intelligence or waste time by talking about that. What we are seeing, though, is people scrambling to do this and saying, let's just go and use what we've got on-prem, but to try and secure new cloud workloads or remote work workloads. And that is causing experience problems. It's causing VPN scalability constraints in particular, trying to route everything on-prem to get your web content filtering or your information protection or your threat protection simply isn't really working. And we're going to look at ways we can explore that and mitigate that. And of course, bad actors are out there and trying to exploit this. So we've seen a rise in phishing, in particular at Microsoft. We've seen a rise in COVID-19 related phishing. We're also seeing identities being really, really challenged, especially when someone has rushed to put their Azure Active Directory or set up Azure Active Directory, put their identities online. They really, really need to be addressing how you're going to secure those identities. Can we move on to the next slide then, please? And we'll quickly cover off what we see as the most effective things that you should be doing. So if you do 3 things, or in fact, if you do one thing, just one thing, turn on multi-factor authentication. The reason being, again, this is all about enabling remote access to apps. This is just making sure that when people are behind their firewall, they may be using bad passwords, they may be relying on the perimeter to protect them. You're fundamentally putting everything out there. I realize I'm telling you stuff you already know here. I'm not meaning to insult your intelligence, but just get multi-factor authentication turned on already. That will solve 99.9% of the attacks that we're seeing, particularly against identity. If you want to use Have I Been Pwned, for example, that's a great tool to show people the extent of the problems that may have. But fundamentally, just if you do one thing, it's multi-factor authentication. Next, it's about managing apps and devices. So we're suddenly seeing a spike of unmanaged devices trying to access corporate resources. You've got a choice there. You can say, well, do you know what? I'm going to allow it, but I'm going to take over application management where I can, particularly on a mobile device, or I'm simply going to restrict appropriately and either manage devices or make a strategic decision to not manage devices but limit resources. And that's onto the next piece, which is the protect corporate resources. So the most common thing that we're seeing on that one is when people roll out teams and don't put conditional access in place. It just means that you've got the ability, or someone has the ability, to log on from their home PC, install the full Teams client, and take any data they want onto their home PC. Simplest thing there to do is, if you're on an unmanaged device, have a conditional access rule that comes in and says, if you're not on a managed device, your only experience is browser and download is blocked. So I realize that's a real 2-minute view of what you should do, but if you do 3 things, do those 3 things. If you do one thing, make it MFA. And then if we move on to the next slide, just a quick summary of some of the resources that you'll see out there. So in Microsoft UK, we've put together a report saying these are the 10 things you should be considering when you're looking at resilient operations, and in particular remote access. That's aka.ms resilient operations. Secondly, there is a fantastic single site does it all resource that talks through how we approach this, the resources that we're providing for people. You'll see a message from Microsoft, which might sound a little bit un-Microsofty if you know us, but or you know us for a while. We are not trying to get you to buy new stuff here. We want you to take the stuff you've already got and turn it on and get the most out of it. That is absolutely what we want you to do. You've already got likely a load of this stuff, just get it turned on. And to get it turned on, there is a fantastic site down here, which is this docs link at the bottom. That is a single site that shows you how to get conditional access up and running, how to enable access to on-prem resources. From a technical perspective, it really is worth looking, making sure you've got a tick box against everything in there. So that was a bit of positioning and a bit of Nick's view on, if you do 3 things, do these 3 things. I'm going to hand back over now to continue the discussion.
Nice one, thanks, Nick. Okay, guys. I mean, to sort of take the conversation on from there. I mean, I completely agree with sort of Nick's sentiment around some of the fundamentals and building blocks from obviously from a foundational stage around how we can start to look to secure things, right? And effectively, in terms of some of the engagements and some of the client experiences we've been having with clients who are looking to obviously sort of dive deeper into this realm, there's pretty much 6 key phases to start considering. as well, right? So the first one we start looking at is things like networking, which is what's going to be obviously a sort of big thing, specifically if you're going to go down the road of things like M365 and cloud-based type services, what all of those things mean. The second one, and effectively the spine of the conversation that we're having today, is around things like identity. You'll hear myself and obviously Nick reinforce that point earlier, as well as Steve later on talk about some of the bits and pieces around identity that we're looking to obviously compensate for, secure, as well as then manage, especially specifically within the sort of cloud space more than anything. The third thing is around things like Windows 10. Start unlocking some of those enterprise features. I do agree with Nick's point there as well. You have a lot of capabilities at your disposal. Lots of organizations seldom use them, either for a lack of understanding or there's legacy reasons as to why some of those bits and pieces from an enterprise perspective, specifically within Windows 10, haven't been turned on. So start to unlock the current capabilities you already own is obviously a big thing. The phase 4 side of things then is to start looking at Microsoft's M365's apps for the enterprise, look where you can offload or migrate and mitigate to obviously cloud-based services. Mobile device management is something that we at Paramount have obviously been striving for a long time. That idea of managing things through the internet presents some really interesting challenges, specifically around things like security. And then finally, the most critical thing every enterprise, we as a business and everyone else has to think about is information protection. The sort of shift in the view these days from a security and posture footprint has massively changed. We don't say we don't care about the device anymore, but we very much care about what's on the device, specifically when it comes to obviously things like data, right? And then so you need to start thinking as an IT administrator or as a sort of head of IT around, okay, well, what are the sort of fundamentals in how I can start putting together a sort of foundational approach to my security? And obviously one of the first things, as Nick mentioned as well, is things like MFA or multi-factor authentication. I can't begin to describe how many times I've been with clients over the years as well. And one of the biggest things you get hacked on, one of the biggest things that sort of goes missing is usernames and passwords. Protecting who is accessing things is always going to be a big thing. With something like Microsoft's multi-factor authentication with Azure Active Directory, it's really never been easier to start implementing some of those bits and pieces. It's free, by the way, if you have certain prerequisites and bits and pieces in play already. So sort of having that initial contact point to a service from an end user's perspective, kind of secured in terms of multi-factor authentication is going to be a big thing, right? You can ensure as well that account protection then reaches, I think Microsoft's statistic on this around breaches is 99.9%. You are less likely, obviously, to then be compromised by simply flicking, a sort of single switch. And then again, sort of multi-factor authentication isn't just at the device layer in terms of log on and stuff like that. It sometimes gets a little bit confused with things like Windows Hello and all that type of stuff. But what we're trying to do is obviously make sure that the person accessing the information is that person. You can obviously then use that across a wide range of applications, right? Specifically across your M365 stats as well. Following on from that, when you start to look to obviously add in that additional layer of obviously sort of security around things like conditional access. I saw something a while ago, and again, to Nick's point, there are people out there that are designed to do you harm. I saw a slogan with one of my clients. The sort of slogan reads something along the lines of, learn the rules around conditional access like a pro so you can break them like an artist. And I think that kind of really rings true in terms of sort of black hat and grey hat communities out there, obviously trying to look to obviously do businesses harm more than anything, right? You can very quickly start to put some of these bits and pieces in play as well. You'll hear us talk about this zero trust side of things as well, where you make certain assumptions that are a good thing from an IT perspective, where you assume every resource is out on the open internet. Your big thing there is around protecting corporate data, but fundamentally in terms of what conditional access is, it's the following rules have to be true before I allow you access to this service, right? And one of those points or one of those triggers that gets kicked off in terms of an event could be something such as multi-factor authentication. And we'll go on to the next slide in a moment when we obviously go ahead and talk about more of the implementation, some of the considerations and prerequisites around obviously turning some of those bits and pieces on, right? Single sign-on has really been a godsend for a lot of clients these days. As you would imagine, people are working across a sort of wide range of application, and single sign-on for us here at Paramount is definitely around sort of delivering that end user experience. where you are doing your best to mitigate against things like passwords and, again, separate usernames and so on. So really being able to give that end user the capability to access all of his or her applications in a seamless fashion is obviously going to be a big thing. We're seeing that more and more and more adapted into, for example, the SaaS world these days, right? Things like Azure Active Directory and My Apps is also something we're seeing people use a lot these days. So providing that capability set where you are literally allowing the users to access something once through the right levels of authentication in conjunction with something like conditional access, then have that smooth, easy to use experience for him or her to be as productive as they obviously can be. Obviously, without something like single sign-on, you're going to have those bits and pieces we have to remember everything time and time again, right? So as we obviously progress and move down the road with this in terms of building on some of these bits and pieces, remember everything we're talking about here is cloud-driven to some extent, and we'll call out where they're not, but most of the sort of topics we'll be talking about is driven through things like Azure Active Directory, Azure AD Premium as well. For things like MFA, you can get away with lower sets of licensing. The recommendation is to go as high as you can to meet your business needs, right? So you'll need a couple of things to think about there. If you're going to set this up yourself, you're going to need to be a global administrator, would be the first thing as well. You can create yourself some sort of fairly standard test accounts, you know, to sort of start putting some of these bits and pieces in play as well. Another great app, obviously to complement the multi-factor authentication side of things, is the multi-factor authentication app itself, right? It will again allow you, for example, to sort of put in place things like two-factor authentication. There's a couple of standard verification methods where you could use, for example, a password. That's still very much prominent and heavily used these days as well. There's also passwordless as well, right? So you can have a phone sign in, again, where two-factor authentication takes place, where you just be asked, for example, your username, and off the back of that, a PIN. If you're really fancy, you can authenticate with your boat race these days as well. So things like facial sign-ins is obviously there as well. Again, and even things like code generation for certain amounts of access, if you need to have temporary access and so on as well, could be something to consider as well, right? This is very much complemented and driven by conditional access, as we said as well, right? So there's a couple of things to consider around conditional access from an administrative perspective. You are going to need to think about where your users are. Are they in the office? Are they not in the office? What country are they in as well would be a big thing. The type of devices and stuff that they need to, or that you allow them to work from. Additionally, again, making sure that the levels of applications and services you need to enable are controlled, right? You may find yourself allowing full access when you're in the office and read-only access when you're out and about, for example, right? So as an administrator and as an IT department, you do have a lot of flexibility and capability these days. And off the back of that, you can trigger typically three things. The first one is you allow access to that service. Excuse me. You require or you trigger multi-factor authentication, and off the back of that, you can either then block access entirely as well, right? You also see there's something referred to as report-only mode, a really nice feature that's been added in. Previously, you would find yourself kind of doing stuff to your users more than anything, but with report-only mode, it's effectively a new set of conditional access policies that it basically allows you to assess and evaluate the impact that this will have across your environment, right? When we rolled it out initially with Power On, we've been a sort of fully cloud business now for a while. I think initially getting used to that and then obviously dealing with the nuances in terms of a learning experience was obviously a big thing as well, right? Following off the back of that, again, we kind of come back to this idea around things like single sign-on. It does provide an absolutely great experience for end users. Users automatically sign into both on-premise and cloud-based applications, depending on obviously what they are. They don't have to remember a lot of passwords and so on. And it's also from an IT perspective, fairly straightforward and simple to implement, right? It works across a couple of cloud-based authentication methods as well, without kind of going too deep. But from an IT perspective, you need to think of password hash synchronization, as well as then pass-through authentication. Those are a couple of big things, and then things like legacy auth and so on also needs to be considered as a potential thing you turn off or change as part of this as well, right? The other thing to think about here is that things like identity protection is also going to be something to consider. It effectively gives you three really important things, and as Steve goes through the next relevant bits, We'll talk about those as well. Identity protection is going to be a big thing to consider these days. It's going to automate the detection and remediation of identity-based risks, right? Where you are, what you're doing, how you're accessing stuff, and so on. You can also then go ahead and investigate risks using data within that particular portal as well. And then off the back of that, you can export risk data protection to third-party utilities for further analysis, right? If you have those, you've also got ATA and ATP and all this type of stuff you can obviously look to do as well, right? There's an atypical level in terms of identity protection, how that works. So if you are signing in from one place and the next minute you're signing in from 12,000 miles away, that will get flagged. The same also then happens around things like anonymous IP addresses, right? So if you sign in from an anonymous IP address, a Tor browser, whatever the case be, that will also then get flagged. Unfamiliar sign-in properties you've not seen recently for that given user will also get flagged as well. And then things like, you'll pick up on things like malware, leaked IP addresses, leaked credentials, and off the back of that, everything's then analyzed through things like Azure AD threat intelligence as well, right? Really quickly around the sort of last points around this in terms of some of the licensing requirements and considerations. We are talking towards the sort of upper end of the scale here. You will unlock the vast majority of those capabilities in terms of identity protection with Azure Active Directory Premium P2, right? You do have limited access to certain bits and pieces within that stack on a P1 perspective, but P2 is really going to give you the full access across things like security reports, risk detection, risky sign-ins, and so on as well, right? As well as in things like notifications, and again, MFA registration policies as well, just as a consideration. But that's me done. I've waffled on long enough. I'll now hand you over to the very wonderful and charismatic Mr. Steve Beaumont.
Awesome, thanks Heinrich. So obviously as we start to talk about bits and pieces of this, please do put your questions into the chat channel. We will cycle back round and have some more conversations on this, and we've got some demos as well to go through as well. But as things and ideas do get sparked, please jot them down ready. So obviously with Heinrich, thank you very much for going through some of them initial steps, and they are absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, them fundamental building blocks. If you want to start to look at how you secure your environment, especially the more that we're doing as remote and building on top of that traditional things that we used to do with just basically firewalls and VPN connections and forcing all traffic down, in this new brave world that's been around for a while, but we're really focused on it at the minute with everything that's happening with the COVID stuff, changing that approach to the identity side and being able to have some of them very fundamental things like MFA that's been around for ages is so crucial before you start to get really, really fancy. And I'll bring in some of the shiny stuff now that you can do on top of it. So moving on then, assuming that you've gone and you've enabled multi-factor and conditional access at the bare minimum, and you want to be able to say, well, actually, rather than bringing people in via the VPN or drilling holes in and out of our networks, how can we get access to some of our corporate resources when people are either on bring your own devices or just corporate devices where we don't want to completely flatten the VPN and the internet bandwidth out of our corporate? You can start to look at things like Proxy. So Proxy is one of these fairly well known about, but quite often that hidden gem that sits within some of the stuff that you potentially already have. It sits within the main licensing stack for a lot of the bits that we've already been talking about. And it's there and it's designed to actually help publish out internal resources to users on the internet, but hooking into the things we talked around with conditional access and MFA to securely access their internal resources without opening up your DMZ or adding stuff into your DMZ and opening up your firewall ports. The cloud app security stuff is then starting to absolutely go into more of that advanced scenario, and it does step you up into the higher echelons of the licensing terms. And the cloud app security is a relatively new concept for a lot of people. And it's bringing in this idea of what we're now talking around in terms of a cloud access security broker. So something that will sit in between your cloud services. And this isn't, again, just purely Microsoft cloud services. So whenever organizations are using things that are outside of their data center, like Office 365 or Google Drive or Dropbox or Salesforce, all these different types of SaaS services where you don't necessarily have control over the exact data locations where users are accessing it internally within your network, but now having something that you can layer in the middle of it that starts to hook in and see what's going on within them services and who's accessing them, and control even more now with some of the latest announcements about applying things like conditional access to them, so we can take a very good view of if something's happening, what do we want to do to react to it. And the other thing that we'll probably touch on today, or not probably will touch on today, is also around the wonderful Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, or MTP as it's starting to get shortened to these days, which is really starting to take that next evolutionary step away from just having purely an antivirus or anti-malware solution on your system, and actually starting to give you something that you can do with all of the different sensors and metrics and data that have been seen and gathered on your devices in terms of doing that advanced threat hunting post-breach. And that is something that is quite scary when you start to say it that way for most organizations, when you start to change the approach away from just purely a prevention scenario, which is absolutely what a lot of these tool sets is about, and that's about stopping people getting into the environment. But then assuming, you should always assume breach, that at some point somewhere, it usually comes down to human errors, something happens or somebody is within your environment. How can you quickly track, detect, and forensically lock down where people have been going and what the impact of that is, and how to then try and stop further lateral spread within the environment? And that's where we start to talk around what Defender Advanced Threat Protection can help with on that side, as well as some of the newer features in it that is also aimed at prevention and starting to give you a good understanding of what your security posture looks like within your environment. Now, the Azure App Proxy, mention it briefly in a minute, and it'll be something that will be really good to dive into and actually start to show you. And this is about being able to say, well, fine, with a connector that we can put in within the environment, how do we publish out to the Microsoft SaaS plane and integrate it with a lot of the things that Heinrich touched on around the single sign-on side, and make it basically an application that lives alongside all of the rest of your cloud applications, that we can put all these controls around with conditional access, etc., to then basically reverse proxy that application out to your users, depending on what rules you put on which devices they can access it. So it basically uses it as like a hopping point where the connector, excuse me, the connector is then used as that hopping point for 2 seconds, sorry. Wrong time to get a frog in my throat. Uses that stepping point that the cloud service can have a connection to, or it connects out to look for requests that will then route it, and basically the connector that you install on the server will go and pass that request internally and then return the response back to the Microsoft SaaS service that then users connect to access. So users are not actually coming directly into your environment. It's done through this middleman of this app proxy connector that you install on one or more servers within your environment, and then pass through the requests to your cloud application. Now, the good thing is that you can then start to use your public URLs for accessing these internal applications, and then hide all the lovely bits of your internal network behind it, so that users have that consistent feel of just how they access it. The cloud app security that I mentioned earlier, so this is where, when we dive into it, you can actually start to see that it detects and assesses, as I mentioned, what the usage, what type of data. So this has been focused around that idea of how trying to prevent, or at least know about, data exfiltration attempts within your environment. And as Nick touched on earlier, when you do start to have these remote workforces that are going home and trying to now use a plethora of devices, and you can access things like Teams from a web browser, being able to bring that control back in that says not just a definitive harsh no, you may not access, and you must have a corporate device that we haven't given you to be able to support you because we don't have them devices or couldn't even get them out to you at that point. But being able to change that needle to a case of, well, actually fine, you can use your iPad, you can use your personal PC to access the system, to be able to view the data, but we really don't want you to be able to save it down to your device. So acting as that middleman broker that we tunnel the traffic through, we will stop downloads but allow read access. Now, I've talked enough on the Defender ATP side. We'll show you that in a bit more detail. But as you start to build up on the capabilities that you can potentially get access to, and as you bring them in, and this is very much about not trying to overly kill and do everything at the same time. And this is why we take that approach around the whole building blocks concept. As you step up both the maturity of the organization and the awareness of how the tools are, and bringing in the controls and the processes that these tools need to support, you can start to build up to things like Azure Sentinel, which allows you to start to hook so many of your different data points and sources across not just your cloud services, but also your infrastructure side, and be able to bring in the identity piece and see all of these different systems working in harmony, and start to bring in things like machine learning to help you spot and identify anomalies within that data set for your environment, and really start to make things work for you in terms of that data that is going on in the background, and have Microsoft skill and expertise to actually help you see both what's going on, spot trends that a person wouldn't normally spot, and then be able to automate responses to that based on what works best for your processes in terms of automated runbooks that you can design or hook into existing ones that show you some of the best practice responses for your environment. So, if my slides will go on. It's always good to actually see stuff in action. It gives probably a bit more better view into it. Personally, I'm a visual learner, so I like to see what's going on to be able to understand it rather than just listening to my voice. Let me just see how we're doing for some questions. Okay, some good ones potentially there at the moment. And let me break out of my slides then. So, a couple of things that we can go through. Before we dive straight into the MCAS side though, let me just show you the Azure App Proxy. So I've gone into in private because I wanted to be able to sign in and show you right from the outset what it looks like. So if I sign in with my demo system account, which, by the way, if you don't use branding on your logins, highly recommended, because as daft as it is, that is also helping with the security posture side, because making sure it's not a generic thing that can be easily spoofed in phishing emails and stuff, making sure you have some sort of differentiation on your login screens that users can get used to, it does help. So in Azure Active Directory, there is this wonderful thing around App Proxy, so on the main side, which is where we set up the servers. But under enterprise applications, living alongside your other cloud applications and your Microsoft pieces, this is where you can create a new one. When you try to go through the wizard, it will give you this option for the on-premises side. So this is where we mix in both the single sign-on applications that we mentioned about and the App Proxy on-premise applications. You can see in here, I have one with my internal app demo. Now, apart from also being able to assign it and use your usual thing where you can actually assign it to both direct users and AD groups and have them synchronized from on-premise, so the normal sorts of provisioning activities that you have, this allows us to actually then start to take internal URLs and represent how we would access it externally. So I can go to this external URL and it will basically proxy me back internally with my credentials to access this application. Now you can see I am using the Microsoft MS App Proxy URL, but you do have the choice to use your own public URLs It just means that you will need to start securing it with certificates, etc. And I don't have within my demo environment a public-based certificate that I'm just going to switch to easily. So I'm just going to use the public URL. Now, you have various different options. I'm not going to go that much in depth to it today, but you do link this into things like your conditional access. So you can start to say whether you want to block it, allow it, must be only accessed from the UK, or whatever rules that you want to define around it. And this is why I'm saying previously that the MFA and the conditional access are the first initial things to go target and get in, because you start to utilize them then as you step down the various different options. Now, rather than going directly to that URL, which you can, I just want to go and hit this other bit that you heard Heinrich mentioned around the My Apps scenario. So this is where you can publish out all of your different styles of applications. So you can see, yes, I've got all my Office bits and pieces in here, but you can also see that I have this Ninja internal. And again, if you're using that whole single sign-on apps and adding other cloud applications, you might add in here Salesforce, Twitter, Facebook, if you really want people browsing Facebook with corporate accounts, etc. This is how you standardize into that single identity. So I'm logged on as me. And then when you click on an application, it should pass through them credentials, or you can use it to pass through shared generic passwords, or you can just interact directly with the APIs of the applications. Now you can see this has directed me to this sample app, but this is running on that initial server that you saw internally within our network. Is not sat in the DMZ, doesn't have port 443 open, and you can see it's automatically switched it to HTTPS, whereas internally it's not, it's just a HTTP app. So you get that end-to-end SSL encryption now from the connection from your client to the cloud apps, the Azure App Proxy service, and then back internally. So just wanted to show that one to start with. So that's that idea of being able to publish out applications internally and mix it in with your single sign-on based applications. Now, talking about the conditional access side, if I go again to my Azure AD, oops, not that one. Bear with me 2 seconds. Just going to stop sharing my screen very quickly. Re-sign in. Oh, I should have left that one on because it's got MFA on it. And just drop to Azure Active Directory again. That's better. Right. Just quick sense check. I've just shared my screen again. Has that come back through?
Yeah, all good, Steve.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So if I go to conditional access now, so security, conditional access. So I have a Teams lockdown one that is not currently on at the moment. So normally with the conditional access policies, you would be focused on just making sure you choose which applications you want to lock down, the users you want to do, and whether people are using it on like either a domain joined PC or stuff. So in this example one, I've just basically said that I've got to be at least passing MFA because I wanted to introduce that link into the conditional access side with the MCAS, which I'll come on to in a sec. And you can see that I'm basically blocking the downloads. It's in preview at the minute, but I just want to show you what that looks like. There's your lovely report only. And this is the really important one as you do start to try out conditional access. Everything that you do should initially be done in report only mode, so you can at least see what the impact is. And don't go just too gung-ho like I am doing, where if this was applied to everyone, it's immediately affecting it. So now that I've enabled that, if I try and go to my Teams environment, probably a little bit too quick for it. Yep. Let me give that a minute or two because it'll just need to filter through. But in effect, that is now linking in. So when it sees requests to Teams coming through, it will hit MCAS. Now you can see that we've mainly got this hooked up with all of our different Office 365 stuff as you'd expect, that's going to be our main usage within our environment. So I want to see what's going on with there. And you can see it's starting to do things like checking what's going on in terms of usage and unusual patterns. You see there was a data exfiltration to an unsanctioned app that happened recently. And you can drill in and get more information. And I do believe that when we checked this last, it was just happens to be Rhiannon who was doing some marketing bits and pieces and was uploading some stuff to Google Collaboration Platform for a specific editing purpose. But we got alerted by it because Google is not one of our usual applications. So if I show you our discovered application sets, you can see that we have this concept of either approved. So yep, we've approved Skype for Business and Office 365 and so on. And then as we go down the stack, there are some stuff we have as unsanctioned. So we want to be flagged if people are uploading stuff into the Google Collaboration Suite because that is not our default standard. So we get them alerts sent back through. Now, let me just try again very quickly. Let me just stop my screen a second while I just check where it takes me to. It's because I used it earlier and it is now insisting that I go back to the same place. Let me try a new in private window. Teams.microsoft.com. Am I still signed in? I'm still signed in, aren't I? Last attempt and then see whether the demo gods want to like me today or not. See, MFA kicks in immediately. Stay signed in. So you can see at the top here now, or actually and on the full screen as well, it's immediately kicked in to say that this application is being monitored. So it knows that I've added this to the list. I'm specifically getting captured by the conditional access, and anything I then go in and do will have the block downloads applied. Not going to go fully into it at the minute because I don't know what I'm going to hit, etc. But this is now being monitored by the MCAS and all them conditional access policies and the more granular control that we have within the MCAS in terms of actions-based responses based on actions can be pushed out via this side. Now, the other couple of bits were around Defender ATP. So this gives us that idea of being able to now start to monitor what's going on within the environment, see whether alerts are being detected by either antivirus, by the rest of the Defender suite with real-time monitoring on the networking side and bits, the sensors that are being gathered, and push it back up here as an actionable alert to then be able to go and respond to outbreaks or suspicious activity that's occurring. Which is great because it gives us that daily operational thing. However, it's gone a little bit above and beyond that now, where we can start to see both on the threat analytics side, what is being recommended to be aware of from experience from Microsoft as they're spotting stuff, the wider community as they're spotting attack vectors and specific CVEs. But more importantly, it also gives you actionable information by being able to tell you which devices are vulnerable to this, and then what mitigations are to be able to go and stop and prevent them activities within your environment. And it gives you that sort of all-up score that helps you understand exactly where you are in terms of being your security posture and having it as good as you can. In addition to that, you also get this lovely vulnerability dashboard now as well that helps to see that scores, where you should be applying stuff. Now, unfortunately, we are, 1-2 days after Patch Tuesday. So a lot of our devices are now sat there waiting for updates. And you can see that uptick of the exposure risk as we need to go and apply updates. But it's not, again, just purely on the Microsoft stack. It will start to show you around known third-party vulnerabilities. And again, you can start to see what actions you need to be able to take. So it's that intelligent awareness now of the security posture of your environment and what you need to go and do to actually drive that remediation within your environment, as well as your daily operational tasks. Final thing on this one is the advanced threat hunting side. So for your security teams, you've got a massive wealth of information, and you can start to actually go and query all of this different collected information that you have in one central place and run queries right across your estate. So in this example, I'm actually looking to see where Adobe Acrobat, because again, it is unfortunately one of the more vulnerable applications and one of the most common applications, but we're looking where it's actually being used now to be able to establish a level of persistence, because Adobe Acrobat Reader should not be in the main startup folder. Yes, the updaters and background services and stuff do run, but not the main executable. And that would allow you to run that across all of your devices and all the timelines, because this is not just a live view. This gives you that historic side that you can go and start to do, and you can build up that investigation side. Now, as a bit of a whirlwind tour of 3 or 4 of the main things, Heinrich, Nick, while I'm in the consoles, is there anything that specifically you guys want to call out or you want me to show very quickly, if I can?
I think you've done a good job covering off most of that. Yeah, nothing that I can think of at the top of my head immediately. I suppose in terms of the cloud app catalogs, in what it may or may not cover, is that worth kind of going over in terms of discovery?
Yeah, am I still in? I'm in here, that's close enough, isn't it? So if I go back to my enterprise applications, go for a new application. So gallery wise, that number keeps on going up all of the time. So with nearly 3,500 choices now, you will have quite a lot of the most common applications in there. So you can see some of the big hitters right at the top of the list. What other type of things have we got in there? Any particular ones that you can think of that we see quite often within organizations?
Yeah, we see social media based apps heavily. End users being able to install their own cloud-based stuff in terms of Spotify and even YouTube apps, and Dropbox is obviously quite a common one, because you could have both corporate and standard ones for that, or personal ones for that. Mega is a big one. I've seen a couple of clients that have to do with Mega quite recently as well. Yeah, it's made by domain with the name of Kim.com, and Mega is a cloud-based sharing service. Yeah, similar to Dropbox.
Yeah, so this is the thing, the different ranges of it, and I think file sharing is probably the biggest one for me around being able to control it. So adding it in and being able to block it is one thing. Being able to add it in and monitor usage, another thing, especially with the cloud app security stuff. But then finally being able to say, well, fine, you can use it for certain business case scenarios. Now, this group of users specifically have been authorized to use it, and here is how we control provisioning of the accounts into it, is absolutely key. And that's probably the biggest difference with the different types of the cloud apps. So you've got ones where you're doing basically pass-through authentication. So you can hook it up to have single sign-in to that cloud-based application, and they trust your source of authority for the accounts. And you have that connection in there then for the SAML-based authentication from Azure AD into theirs. So I think LastPass comes to mind for us, because we use it in terms of not having individual accounts set up on their side with unique passwords, but using our actual credentials across. You've got applications where you can do basically like name matching, and it'll say, fine, we've got a user in their side, and if we're passing it across with the right token stuff, we approve it into there. You got the ones where it needs the user object within their application, but you actually commission using their APIs the object and stuff from your tenancy, and it will drive that onboarding experience and create the accounts, but you provision it from the Azure AD side. And then finally, you have things like Twitter, where especially for corporate marketing teams and stuff, there will generally be one account that is used for accessing the corporate Twitter account, and you don't really want to give everyone in the marketing team the same username and password, because you get into scenarios where if you do have hiring firing situation, both new people coming in, don't want to have to give it to them, and as people leave, you don't want to have to then change the account details and give it back and distribute it to every single team member again. So you can use things like on the Twitter side, basically password-based sign-on, where you store the credentials within the Azure AD side, and then when you access it from the My Apps account portal side, it will basically commission that and push that username and password into, it's going to come up again today, hey, MFA again. It will push that username and password from the Azure AD stored side of it into the actual application for you. So if I find, is this where I realize I haven't got Twitter published to myself anymore? Oh, somebody's taken it away from there it is. So if I go and log into Twitter, oops, I've not got my extension on. Let's see if I can get this done quickly. I can't even see the install button. Can anyone see the install button?
It's asking you to sign in first.
It's also because I've not allowed extensions. There
Yeah.
we go. Try that again.
I think you with access to this might make our lovely marketing girl Rihanna very nervous now, Steve.
Did I not tell marketing that I have access to our corporate Twitter?
You won't have for long.
I am very concerned right now.
I am also just aware that I set that demo up so long ago, and there's every possibility that the password that I used on that has been changed by marketing.
Good.
But the flip side of that is when you do use that not in a demo capacity and you are controlling it, if it does need to be reset, you reset it and then you store it centrally. Hey, look at this. Which one should I go for? That one. You can reset it centrally and then obviously everyone just gets to use it. So there we go, and straight in. Oh no, that's taking me into my home one. The joys of the demo gods. But you get the concept of where now you can actually build up this complete catalog regardless of how the access usage is. So if it is in this catalog, highly recommend going and digging in and seeing what the different options are when you do have to use them and you're not using the other tools to restrict access, control access. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Okay, so enough of me talking. Let's see what some of the questions and bits and pieces are that have been coming through and have probably a bit more of a tailored discussion on it. So in terms of some of the things that are coming through, and Heinrich, you obviously have a lot of these conversations with people all the time. I also know that Nick, while you're on the line, and you'll have obviously another exposure to a wider, broader range of people as well as they start to ask questions around this. I know we had a conversation earlier as well around the wonderful recommendation that often gets put out there as one of the first things for people to go and look at when securing down their edge environments when it comes to Office 365 and stuff. And that's around the recommendation to just go and disable legacy auth as quick as possible and en masse, because that is, well, if I ask the question to all of us, in terms of disabling legacy auth, how easy is that? And secondly, why is that recommendation even there in the first place?
I'll jump in on that one then. I mean, it's very, very easy to do. if you want to do it without any side effects, that's a different question, I think. It's very easy for me to, and I often do this, just say, just turn it off already. The challenge is, as I think we discussed, is, when someone's got X applications out there that are already reliant on legacy auth and, they're legacy applications that haven't been modernized. It suddenly goes from a question of a simple identity into a whole new, actually, we've got to look at doing an app refresh. If we're doing an app refresh, are we simply doing a lift and shift and trying to authenticate to Azure in a different way, or are we doing a full app modernization? It suddenly becomes a very simple little flippant question that a guy in marketing says, just turn it off already. Because if you've got that on an MFA, then you've left your back door open. It really does become a much more nuanced thing. So yes, it's the good news is there's ways of remediating all these things. Yeah,
I think, like you just saying, Nick, that the ability now to start turning on the conditional report access in things like report mode, so you can start to get visibility of what that impact's going to look like, as well as just because legacy auth doesn't work well with some of the newer security controls and stuff, it's absolutely need to be done as soon as possible, but take it easy, because while most organizations shouldn't have a problem with it, you can always guarantee there will be that one piece of application that's been sat in the corner for God knows how long and forgotten about that suddenly rears its head even after it's been working fine for the past 20 years.
indeed.
Cool. So another question that's just come in on that side around what I was looking at earlier. So just checking this. Okay. I take it everyone can hear us as well, because there's a couple of questions around audio side. I'm assuming it's okay, because I can see some replies on that. But going back to that whole idea around the conditional access, so just been asking if we can do a demo on creating the policy to block downloads in Teams from unmanaged devices. Yes, that was more or less what I was showing a minute ago. I will just call out again, though, it's really important to understand that to be able to block the downloads piece, that is very reliant on having the MCAS integration. So while conditional access will allow you to stop at the door as such, and you can say, well, fine, do you want to be able to allow them in at all? Then yes, that's just part of the normal conditional access side. But doing the blocking of downloads is the integration with the MCAS side. But it is a case of choosing who you want. So in this case, I'm just going to say, fine, everyone. Do pay attention to that. Be very, very careful. If you go and block certain applications like the Azure management layers or the Graph API, you're not getting back into your environment. If you are going to do an all users, please, 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 please put an exclusion in there for at least a break glass account. So you should always have at least one break glass account that you can then reuse to get back into the environment that is excluded from your conditional access policies. But let's be brave. And
just riffing on that point, actually, Steve, that is absolutely crucial for so many reasons. There is advice on the break glass accounts and how to configure break glass accounts, as well as I'm sure you've got. But just echoing that one, it's so easy. I think every admin in their own tenant has done it. Just make sure you don't do it in your own tenants. And that break glass piece, again, amplifying that as much as I possibly can, because it is absolutely critical.
Yeah. It's not to say just have an account that has no security controls assigned to it, because that's even worse. Like I say, there is specific guidance on how to secure that break glass account, but you need to make sure that it's there and it's available and considered when you are controlling the security layer and the lockout of your environment. So yeah, I'll again re-echo back to you what you're just saying on your echoing of mine, Nick. It is so important. We do need to stress that so much. So don't do what I'm doing, basically. So the cloud app. So this is the important bit. So within here is where, if I minimize some of the stuff that I've got open on the sides, is where you start to control what it is that you're accessing. So there is a specific one for Teams, So on the other previous one, I just had the wider Office 365, but there is a specific Teams-based application. So it depends on how granular you want to get on this one. But this is where we're now targeting basically all users that are accessing Teams within the environment. At which point, so you can again start to configure it and say, well, actually, I only want to apply this policy if I see them coming in from outside of our trusted locations. So you can specify all of our internal networks if you wanted, or how you want to slice and dice that. Or I could say, and the question specifically was unmanaged devices. So if I say, well, actually, fine, I do want to apply this to everything, or I'm only bothered about when it's Windows, for example. Let's go set that side. But your biggest one for unmanaged is where you decide on this. So an unmanaged device for me counts as either one of these two. Hybrid Azure joined devices. So if you have them joined to your on-premises domain, and you're saying only if it is a domain joined device are you allowed to access this stuff. So actually fine, I want to make sure it's on there. Or it is marked as compliant. So these are the two that define whether it is a managed device or not. So this is where you can start to say, well, fine, grant it if it's on there, just allow it through and all the rest of it. Or if we're not ticking them, it's basically classed as, oh, no, fine. They'll bring your own device sides of it. So you'd be looking at having a combination policy. You'd have one which basically says, yep, fine, you can come in if you're on one of these two devices. So if it hits that policy, you're allowed in. And then another one like this that says, actually, no, if you're not on there, then fine, we want to make sure that we are applying one of these controls that says we want to make sure that you have multi-factor authentication. So that is being applied. If we see that on an unmanaged device, then we will go and add in this conditional access policy and basically say that we want to block the downloads. So therefore, you now start to build up this control that says, if you basically give MFA access, then we will block downloads to that device. And I have another one that says basically if you're on a approved device, domain joined or compliant, which means it's basically enrolled in Intune and showing healthy, then allow you in. Does that make sense, hopefully? And I'm not going to create it even in report only mode because I did choose all users without that break glass account. What else have we got on that side? Let's have a look on the list. Heinrich, what other questions do you want to pick out of that side?
I was severely struggling with the mute button there, but apologies. I'm
looking through them. Cloud applications, what if you have your own line of business application or third-party application that you want to integrate with? For the single sign-on side, it's all going to come down to the APIs and stuff you have within your application. So a lot of the modern applications these days are using SAML-based authentication, and that's the best one. I'm by no means an expert on this one. We have the team that's probably better judged for how you integrate specifically with it, but it's working with the developers of your partner supplied applications to see how that SAML authentication scheme is done, and things called the Schism APIs to actually be able to then push them authentication tokens from your Azure AD side, or depending on whether you want to provision them accounts if they have to be done internally within the application. But yes, it doesn't have to be on that main list. So if something's not there and it's not by the likes of Microsoft and Google and so on, then you can still add integrations into other applications but you just need to work with them suppliers around the authentication schemes and the SAMLs and all the rest of it to integrate it and create lovely XML and JSON schemas that you put in as you're provisioning it in the portal.
Also had one regarding MFA services on premise.
Oh yeah.
That's it. This is one of those ones where we have to caveat it with it depends. So I think as of July 1st, 2019, June or July, I'll be corrected on that. Microsoft will no longer offer MFA server for new deployments, so to speak. So you will be required to kind of go down the traditional cloud-based road. However, if you do have an existing on-premise implementation of MFA server on-premise, then Microsoft will make available the relevant downloads and updates and so on for you. But new implementations of anything on-premise from an MFA perspective, currently speaking, isn't supported. It doesn't mean it's not possible, it's just not supported. And the recommendation anyway is to go towards the Azure-based side of things anyway, where possible.
Yeah, I'd echo that one actually, Heinrich, saying, yeah, it really is looking to use Azure Active Directory as your primary directory there. And that's, again, I realise that's a leap. It does require a lot of change in some organisations and a big change in approach and trust. But it's something that the NCSC, it's not just us saying this, it's something that the NCSC are recommending as the approach too.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, and I definitely back that. It's something that we're seeing again heavily driven within the NHS as well, around those particular areas. So MFA being cloud driven makes far more sense. Also reduces that need for anything on premise anyway.
That's the thing for me, is reducing that need for stuff on premise. So while I've always, and people that know me will know I'm a control freak, I like to have the ultimate control, be able to tweak with the registry settings and this and that knob to make it do exactly what I want to do. In that same vein, I'm also very busy. We're all very busy. Having yet another server to patch, maintain, update when things are released, and the speed that Microsoft moves at these days is phenomenal. So having to constantly keep on-premise things like the old MFA servers and stuff up to date, adding the new feature sets as they come through and stuff, is just a burden that doesn't make sense anymore. Being able to offload it into the Azure, let Microsoft do the heavy lifting in terms of the config and the availability and all the rest of it, so that you get to have the control over the policies and how you want it to be used, makes so much more sense these days.
Yeah, I'd agree. For me, it's a bit of a conversation like your Exchange server control was a couple of years back, or depending where you're on your cloud journey. To me, it's the same sort of thing, exactly to that point. Give up on knowing the zeros and ones and owning the zeros and ones, and really, really work out what it is. Well, how do you take your policy and how do you help? In fact, this is about the evolution of an IT department, really, isn't it? But yeah, getting onto that idea of actually making a difference and helping the business do stuff rather than just running the tin.
Yeah, security's hard enough at the best of times. So being able to actually focus on, like I say, the policies and the controls and the processes of how best to use it and to make it seamless wherever possible and invisible to the end users goes a long way to be able to focus on that than making sure that services and stuff are up and running.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the end user experience is really at the forefront of what IT needs to think about, especially around then, even on the back end from a business perspective, as you say, it gets very expensive very quickly running tin, especially these days, especially if organizations are sweating assets. So going towards that kind of cloud-based model where you can then start giving people access from pretty much anywhere in a quick way. We talked about our Proxy and so on as well. I think does make a lot of sense. And ironically, there's a couple of bits here on our Proxy we've been asked for. So the initial question, and Steve, you can elaborate on this as well, is what do we need to think about in terms of our Proxy and users working from home to protect data? Remember, in terms of giving access to that application, web apps is a fairly common one with things like our Proxy. You can containerize that. You can mitigate, obviously, things in terms of how the app functions and so on. Some of the other bits and pieces that Steve showed you there as well is something we covered in greater length in a previous sort of webinar I did with Peter Edgerton, who's the MVP for some of these bits and pieces, is around things like app protection policies. Is something else to consider and think about there as well. And the other one there is around, I think, do I need a VPN for something like app proxy? No, it could negate the need for your end users to need a VPN. It doesn't mean your end users do not need a VPN. However, it does mean that you could think about putting that application within arm's reach for them through office.com, simple as that. And then off the back of that, they can then access that without requiring to hop into your network.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like a lot of this, it's the horses for courses scenario. If under a normal business practice routine, it's like this super sensitive application, you must connect to it from a corporate device with a VPN connection, great. When you've got 90% of your workforce at home, not necessarily using a corporate device, and that is your key business operational application, you look for different ways. And if this allows you to securely deliver it to devices with that level of control over who, what, where, and all the rest of it, and whether they're happy devices, without having to then get them to bring in their unwashed devices on VPN, etc., then you absolutely start to consider how that can be used. One other good question that just came in on that side then is because obviously we've been talking a lot around the Azure AD side and how it hooks in and cloud-based services and stuff. If a customer has ADFS in the mix and they're not doing password hash synchronization, so they're doing all of their actual authentication on premises when people are accessing stuff via ADFS, what type of impact does that have on all the stuff that we've been talking about? So I know we see lots of customers that still have ADFS. So it's not a case of you must absolutely just go and migrate everything and get rid of your entire ADFS infrastructure and have just a pure Azure AD Connect based. This is still working on the principle of hybrid as well. You don't have to have a pure Azure AD only. This all works with the hybrid scenarios, absolutely. But then having the ADFS in the mix, no, it's still, everything can still be done. The MFA side of it, conditional access, all still works with ADFS in the mix. There are some setup bits that you have to do specifically on it. There's some configurations to make sure that certain checks are being passed backwards and forwards between online and on-premise. This is, I keep on saying on-premise in a minute, on-premises. But no, it absolutely still works with ADFS in the mix. The only thing I would say is if you are not currently doing either password hash sync or you purely put ADFS in place when originally it was the recommended and probably the only way to majorly do it, please do revisit your ADFS need. Because again, that idea of simplifying infrastructure, making this as simple as possible to do and maintain, the capabilities of Azure AD Connect now to be able to do the authentication side, either we're synchronizing the passwords up to Azure AD, which is not as scary as it just sounds in that side. You're not just purely giving unfettered access to Microsoft to see all your passwords, but also with options like pass-through authentication, where you can actually bring that authentication back to on-premise, the same as we do with ADFS, but just using Azure AD Connect. There are options there now to, again, simplify your authentication mechanisms without having to maintain the beast that ADFS is if you're not using ADFS for anything other than supporting your Azure AD authentication.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. Sorry, I tried it, but my mic was mucking about me, sorry. But yes, and especially around things like single sign-on as well. So sort of the registration of Windows 10 device with Azure AD without the need for ADFS is fully supported and highly recommended. And the sort of advice to organizations these days, if you are not federating out to someone else or something else, beyond obviously your own Azure Active Directory tenancy, then yes, I completely agree with you. AD Connect is a far simpler and sort of streamlined solution to kind of get identities up into the cloud.
Yeah, so just echoing on that point, I think that you made, Steve, that so much has changed in the past 5 years, if not more, particularly around ADFS and the approaches. If you did make the decision to go to ADFS, a little while ago, because that was the right thing to do. That was the choice. Please,
Yep.
please, please do look and see what AD Connect can do, because it is so much simpler. It really is. And of course, our competitors are also looking at that to say, hang on a minute, ADFS, we can simplify that. The answer is that Microsoft can too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right, probably pick up on this last question because I'm conscious that we are getting towards the end of the session time and just wanting to do some wrap-ups on it. Another quick question around, can access to the local file shares be proxied by app proxy? Unfortunately not. So the app proxy is absolutely designed to be a web-based application proxy service. It doesn't proxy everything. So I know there are other various solutions that get used in the past for this around things like the Citrix solutions and stuff for file share access. There was some stuff built into Windows quite a while back for doing a similar thing. So it's like almost an on-premise OneDrive thing for your internal file shares. Okay, was it work folders? My memory is even more sketchy.
Yeah,
on
it
that.
was.
It's been so long.
Yeah.
It never really got a big uptick on it. What I will say though is there's not necessarily the app proxy stuff for doing access to this or some of the Windows Server stuff, but there is something called Azure File Sync that could potentially help you on this side. So whereas the Azure File Sync was primarily designed to be able to almost be like a, well, actually it wasn't designed for it, but it was primarily used in the initial days as like a business continuity plan to be able to take content from a local file server, replicate it up to an Azure file share, and then you could replicate it back down to other file shares. So kind of use Azure as that hopping middle ground. And then if something did go pop with a local data center, you still had your files and stuff up in the cloud. But by the very nature of it doing that replication of files up into Azure file shares, and with the new stuff that's just coming through on being able to actually put in NTFS ACLs on Azure files now, and being able to use your directories to secure access to files and folders in the Azure file, that may be an option that could potentially be used. So you could replicate everything up into Azure and then just have users go and access it from a URL and work on it as if it was a local file server, but directly across the internet, but still using your NTFS ACLs to go and access it on that side.
I believe there is a way of doing this if you're using Azure AD Connect, actually, to get access to on-prem file shares and on-prem printers too. I'll share the link. I realise this is dangerous when you get someone who's in a marketing team talking at quite deep technology, but I believe that is possible, and I'll share the link with you guys.
Yeah, so the printing side, if that's the one I'm thinking of, is just coming through on private preview at the minute, and that's Universal Cloud Print. So starting to be able to publish out into Azure AD your file print queues, etc., or even some of the newer printers that are coming through don't even need to have an on-premise file server. They will just literally work directly to the Azure AD side, and you can see your print queues and publish them down to devices and so on. Definitely, if you've got it, Nick, it's that one there, is it? For the has this got the bit for the
noted at the top? It's basically, yeah, if you note at the top, any Windows 10 device can access any on-prem.
If this is the bit that I'm thinking of in terms of accessing the thing, is this the bit where actually if it is a pure Azure AD, yeah, the pure Azure AD joined device, yeah. So this is where if you don't have a domain joined device, but you're doing things like autopilot and getting pure Azure AD joined devices, when you are then connected to your internal LAN, either via VPN or when you physically bring it in, this will do that whole Kerberos translation with the Azure AD auth token via AD Connect to allow you access, but it doesn't proxy that outside of your network to get access to. But yeah,
that's a good point, because I don't think that would work with hybrid joined. Is my assumption there, but I could be wrong.
No. But this is actually another side topic and probably a conversation for another entire webinar altogether, where a lot of organizations are still using that hybrid joined devices, so physically joined to your on-premises domain and then hybrid joined to Azure AD, rather than starting to really progress down into the pure cloud-only joined scenario. And that's a topic for another webinar. But part of that, people should be looking at it. They should be paying attention to how that works within their environment. And this is a key factor of how you can use and secure access into traditional existing resources when you're using that non-domain joined but Azure AD joined device within your environment. So this is something that should absolutely be looked at and start your planning around how you use them Azure AD only joined devices within your environment.
I knew it was dangerous.
No problem. Right.
I've answered the one question there, so.
Oh, sorry, is there another one, did you say, before we wrap up? No? Fine. Just bringing some of this stuff to a close then. So obviously everything that we talked about does have some form of licensing. I know Heinrich briefly touched on the fact that the MFA one is probably, well, actually the MFA and the conditional access at a basic level don't have the need for licensing. They're included within the Azure AD free if you are using only the Authenticator app. So if you want to use MSM, SMS or phone-based or text-based and all the rest of it, that does require the licensing side. But if you are just using purely the Azure Authenticator app, then MFA is basically free. And same with conditional access, there are some base level ones which restrict or enforce MFA for administrators. That's free. Anything past that, you're basically looking at being able to leverage, which most organizations have, either Azure AD Premium P1 or starting to branch into the wider EMS or the Microsoft E3 type of stacks that give you access to a lot of this. Obviously, as you then stepped up into some of the shiny stuff, that's when you start to breach into the E5 licensing SKUs or some of the security related special add-on SKUs. So absolutely go and check and see what you're entitled to, because the whole point of this was not to say go out and buy lots of lovely licenses. Is you may be surprised when you see what licensing SKUs you already have sat there, what features you're not currently using. And that's always been the thing of this. If you're synchronizing stuff up into Azure AD, which you need to be able to do, then look at what you can turn on. And that's echoing Nick's first initial point. MFA, conditional access, ASAP should be your building block starting. Then look at consolidating and democratizing your apps with a single sign-on, and then start looking at some of the other shiny things that you may have access to. Please, 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 please use that pilot approach. Don't just carte blanche turn this stuff on within your environment, and absolutely use the reporting aspects where it's available in things like conditional access to see what that impact is. And again, echoing what we've echoed a few times, have a break glass account, but a secure break glass account. Then as you start to investigate, look into this and want to understand how you might be able to get the best usage out of it, how you start to talk around, as we verged into on some of the conversations, that transformation process of your IT part of the business and your wider organization, please do reach out to us. You can have the lovely joy of people like myself and Heinrich come and talk even more about this, as well as the rest of the team. And everything is basically available, especially if you're public sector and stuff. A lot of the stuff that we have are within the G-Cloud stuff from the government, and we're on various other different frameworks that do make interacting with ourselves very easy, and especially a lot of your existing partners will probably be able to help as well in putting in contact with us through the licensing avenues and schemes. Got that question covered. Yep, brilliant. Well, we are almost up to time, running probably tad bit early, which is not always a bad thing. We'll basically wrap up. There's nothing more left to say that there are numerous different ways that you can get in contact with us. The various different social media platforms, our website. Please do go check the website out, because a lot of the webinars, or not a lot, all of the webinars that we do get posted back onto there for on-demand viewing. So you can go and browse through the catalogue of stuff that we've been doing recently and over time. And again, just reach out to us generally via email, etc., if you have follow-on questions, or drop us a line and actually speak to one of us. Any last closing summary points from yourself, Heinrich or Nick?
No, done a great job covering that, Steve. I'm happy.
Again, great. Fantastic, Steve. Really informative. Thank you for that.
No, thank you guys, both presenters that have joined us today. Absolutely a pleasure to, as always, have these type of discussions and help people understand where they can potentially gain benefits from stuff that they already own, or might not have even been aware of as options and available stuff that is out there. So thank you, Heinrich, thank you, Nick, and thank you everyone that has joined us today. I hope you found it useful, and please do join us again for the next ones. Thank you very much, everyone.